Story 1. The Footprints in the Snow. In the heart of a forgotten corner of rural America, where the pines stand like silent sentinels and the snow falls in relentless sheets, there lies an old brick house, weathered by time and steeped in secrets. It was here, in the winter of 2012, that Ethan Caldwell, a man in his mid-20s with a steady job and a fiancée named Clara, began to unravel a mystery that would haunt him for nearly a decade. The house, a family heirloom passed down from his grandparents to his father, and now to him, sat at the edge of a sprawling forest, a wilderness so vast it seemed to swallow the horizon whole. Its isolation was both a comfort and a curse, a place where Ethan felt at home yet perpetually on edge, as though the trees themselves were watching. The first incident came on a crisp Sunday morning, the kind where the world feels hushed under a blanket of fresh snow. Ethan, bleary-eyed from a rare chance to sleep in, trudged out to his pickup truck, his breath clouding in the frigid air. He was halfway to the driver's door when he stopped dead in his tracks. There, etched in the pristine snow, was a trail of footprints. They weren't his, nor Clara's. She was still asleep inside, oblivious to the world. The prints were deliberate, purposeful, leading from the shadowed depths of the woods, across the frost-bitten lawn, and straight to the driver's side of his truck. But what chilled Ethan to his core wasn't their presence. It was their abrupt end. The trail didn't loop around the house, didn't veer toward the windows or the shed. It simply stopped at his truck, as if whoever or whatever had made them had vanished into thin air. Ethan stood frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs. The prints were human, or so they seemed. But there was something off about them. They were too deep, too precise, as though the maker had pressed their weight into the snow with unnatural force. He followed the trail backward, through a gap in the sagging wooden fence that bordered the woods. But the prints grew fainter as they merged with the underbrush, swallowed by the forest's embrace. He told himself it was a prank, a neighbor's kid playing a cruel joke. But the nearest house was a mile away, and no one in their right mind would wander barefoot through the snow in the dead of winter, because that was the other detail that gnawed at him. The prints showed no trace of shoes. Bare feet, raw and exposed, had carved this path. Clara, when he told her later that day, laughed it off at first, her hazel eyes sparkling with skepticism. "Probably just some drunk stumbling through the woods," she said, stirring a pot of chili on the stove. But Ethan couldn't shake the unease that coiled in his gut. He spent the rest of the day pacing the house, checking the locks, peering out the frost-rimmed windows at the encroaching darkness. The woods, usually a source of solace, now felt like a living thing, its branches clawing at the sky, its shadows whispering secrets he wasn't meant to hear. For 2 years, nothing happened. Life moved on. Ethan proposed to Clara under a harvest moon, and they began planning a future in the old brick house. The footprints faded into memory, a strange anecdote to share over beers with friends. But in the winter of 2015, the nightmare returned with a vengeance. It was a gray February morning, the kind where the sky seems to press down on the earth, heavy with the promise of more snow. Ethan stepped outside late for work and froze. The yard was a battlefield of footprints, hundreds of them, crisscrossing the snow in chaotic patterns. They snaked around the house, clustered beneath the windows, and circled the shed like a predator marking its territory. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he realized the truth. These weren't the tracks of one person. There were multiple sets, overlapping and diverging, as though a group had descended on the house in the night. And like before, every single print was barefoot, the toes splayed unnaturally wide, as if the feet themselves were malformed. Clara, woken by Ethan's urgent shouts, emerged pale and trembling. Together, they inspected the prints, their voices hushed as if afraid the woods might overhear. The trails led to every corner of the property but never entered the house itself. It was as if the intruders had been testing the boundaries, probing for weaknesses. Ethan's mind raced with possibilities: cultists, vagrants, something worse. But none made sense. Who would walk barefoot in sub-zero temperatures, leaving no trace of their purpose? Determined to protect Clara, Ethan grabbed his rifle, a weathered Remington he'd inherited from his father, and set out to follow the tracks into the woods. The forest was a labyrinth of snow-draped pines and tangled undergrowth, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The footprints led him deeper than he'd ever ventured as a child, past the familiar trails where he and his brothers had played, into a realm where the trees grew gnarled and the light barely penetrated. For an hour he followed the trail, his breath ragged, his fingers numb around the rifle's grip. Then abruptly the tracks split into two distinct paths, each veering in opposite directions. Ethan's heart sank. Was there more than one? Had they been watching him all along, leading him into a trap? The realization hit him like a physical blow. He was alone, armed but vulnerable, in a wilderness that seemed to pulse with malice. He turned back, the hairs on his neck prickling as he felt unseen eyes boring into him. That night, he and Clara called the police, but the officer who arrived, a grizzled man named Sheriff Holt, dismissed their concerns. "Kids probably," he said, spitting tobacco into the snow. "No crime's been committed." Ethan wanted to scream that this was no prank, that something was wrong, but he had no proof, only the gnawing dread that refused to let go. The incident stopped again, and for 3 years, Ethan and Clara lived in uneasy peace. They got engaged, renovated the house, and tried to convince themselves the footprints were a fluke, but the woods never felt the same. Ethan stopped hiking the trails he loved as a boy, and Clara began to flinch at every creak of the old house. They were on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. It dropped in January 2019, with a ferocity that shattered their fragile sense of security. Ethan woke to a scream. Clara's, raw and terrified. He bolted outside to find her standing in the yard, her face ashen, pointing at the snow. The footprints were back, more numerous than ever, a chaotic tapestry that covered every inch of the property. But this time, there was more. The shed door hung open, its lock smashed, and half of Ethan's tools, hammers, axes, a chainsaw, were gone. Worse still, a new set of prints led to the back door of the house, stopping just inches from the threshold, as if the intruder had stood there, staring inside. Ethan's blood ran cold. This wasn't random. This was personal. He called his friend Theo, a burly outdoorsman with a penchant for hunting and a no-nonsense attitude. Theo arrived within hours, his AR-10 slung over his shoulder, its thermal scope glinting in the winter sun. "We're ending this," he said, his voice grim. Clara begged Ethan not to go, her eyes brimming with tears, but he couldn't let this continue. He kissed her forehead, promising to return, and followed Theo into the woods. The forest was a frozen hellscape, the air so cold it burned their lungs. The footprints led them deeper than Ethan had ever gone, past jagged rocks and frozen streams, into a part of the woods where the trees seemed to lean inward, their branches interlocking like skeletal fingers. For hours they followed the trail, their boots crunching in the snow, their breaths the only sound in the oppressive silence. The tracks were maddeningly elusive, doubling back on themselves, splitting into dead ends that forced them to retrace their steps. Theo, usually unflappable, grew tense, his eyes darting to the shadows. "This ain't right," he muttered. "No one moves like this." As dusk fell, the footprints grew deeper, fresher, as if their quarry was close. Then, without warning, a second set of tracks appeared alongside the first, identical in their barefoot strangeness. Theo swore under his breath, his hand tightening on his rifle. They pressed on, the darkness closing in, until Theo's arm shot out, stopping Ethan in his tracks. He was staring through his thermal scope, his face pale as death. "Don't move," he whispered. Ethan's heart pounded as Theo handed him the rifle. He peered through the scope, and what he saw stole the breath from his lungs. 4 figures stood in a clearing, their heat signatures glowing against the cold. 2 were massive, hunched over like beasts, their movements slow and deliberate. The other 2 were smaller, clinging to a tree, their heads jerking in erratic spasms. They were eating something. Ethan couldn't tell what, but the wet, tearing sounds carried faintly through the still air. And they were naked, their skin exposed to the freezing cold, as if the elements meant nothing to them. Ethan's hands shook as he watched the larger figures lift the smaller ones onto their shoulders. moving with a strange, synchronized grace. They turned and vanished into the woods, leaving only silence in their wake. Ethan and Theo remained crouched behind a tree, too terrified to move, until the cold forced them to retreat. When they finally stumbled back to the house, Clara was waiting, her face etched with fear. Ethan told her only fragments of what they'd seen, but it was enough to break her. She wept, begging him to leave the house, to escape the nightmare that had stalked them for years. The police searched the woods the next day, but fresh snow had erased the tracks, and they found nothing. Sheriff Holt shook his head, muttering about wild goose chases, and left Ethan and Clara with no answers. Theo, haunted by what he'd seen, urged Ethan to move, but the house was all Ethan had, his family's legacy, his anchor. Yet as winter loomed again, the fear grew unbearable. Clara began to sleep with a knife under her pillow, and Ethan installed motion sensor lights that flared to life at the slightest movement. They were prisoners in their own home, watched by the woods that never slept. One night, as a blizzard raged outside, Ethan woke to a sound, a low, guttural hum, like a chant, drifting from the forest. He crept to the window, his rifle in hand, and saw them, faint shapes moving in the snow, their forms blurred by the storm. They were circling the house, their barefoot tracks glowing under the floodlights. Ethan's scream woke Clara, and together they barricaded the doors, their hearts pounding as the humming grew louder, closer, until it seemed to come from inside the walls. The next morning, the tracks were gone, erased by the wind. But Ethan knew they'd be back. He and Clara are packing now, preparing to flee, but the woods seem to cling to them, their shadows stretching across the brick house like a warning. Ethan still hears the humming in his dreams, and he wonders if they'll ever truly escape, or if the things in the forest will follow them, barefoot and relentless wherever they go. Story 2, The Stalker on the Pacific Crest Trail. For as long as he could remember, Lucas Harper had found solace in the wild. The mountains with their jagged peaks and whispering pines were his sanctuary, a place where the chaos of modern life faded into insignificance. At 32, he was a seasoned hiker, his lean frame hardened by years of traversing America's most unforgiving trails. But nothing could have prepared him for the terror that awaited him on the Pacific Crest Trail in the summer of 2024, a journey that would strip away his love for the wilderness and leave him haunted by a presence he could neither see nor escape. Lucas's plan was ambitious but simple. Tackle a 200-mile section of the PCT, a ribbon of earth that wound through the Cascade Range, connecting remote valleys and alpine meadows. He'd park his battered Jeep at the trail's end, hitch a ride to the starting point, and hike back over 10 days, alone with his thoughts and the rhythm of his boots. Solo hiking was his preference, a meditative escape from the noise of the world. He packed light but smart: tent, sleeping bag, dehydrated meals, a .308 rifle for protection, and a satellite phone for emergencies. The trail, he knew, was as dangerous as it was beautiful, home to bears, cougars, and the occasional human predator. But Lucas was meticulous, confident in his skills, and unafraid of solitude. Or so he thought. The first 3 days were a dream. The trail unfurled before him like a painting, its vistas of snow-capped peaks and emerald forests stretching into infinity. Lucas moved with purpose, covering 20 miles a day, his body in sync with the land. At night, he'd veer off the trail to set up camp, pitching his tent in secluded clearings where the stars burned bright and the world felt untouched. He kept a low profile, avoiding other hikers, his campfire small and smokeless to deter attention. For those first few nights, the wilderness was his alone, a perfect communion of man and nature. But on the fourth night, everything changed. Lucas woke in the pitch black of his tent, his heart racing, a primal instinct screaming that something was wrong. The air was heavy, the silence too absolute, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. He lay still, straining to hear, but there was nothing. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant howl of a coyote. Just the oppressive weight of being watched. He grabbed his rifle and flashlight, his hands steady despite the adrenaline flooding his veins, and unzipped the tent. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. His campsite was untouched, his gear undisturbed. Yet the feeling lingered, a cold certainty that he wasn't alone. Back in the tent, Lucas checked his pack, a ritual to calm his nerves. That's when he noticed it. His wallet was gone. Not misplaced, not buried in the chaos of his gear. Gone. His ID, credit cards, $200 in cash, all vanished. He tore through his belongings, his mind racing. Had he dropped it on the trail? Left it outside? But he was meticulous, obsessive about his gear. The alternative was unthinkable. Someone had entered his tent while he slept, rifling through his pack without waking him. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. He didn't sleep that night, his rifle across his chest, his eyes fixed on the tent's entrance. The next day, Lucas pressed on, his senses heightened, his gaze darting to every shadow. He told himself he'd lost the wallet, that it was his own carelessness. But the wilderness no longer felt welcoming. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches clawing at the sky, and the trail, once a path to freedom, now felt like a trap. By the fifth day, more items began to disappear. A lighter, gone from his pocket. His Swiss Army knife, missing from its usual spot in his pack. A handful of energy bars vanished overnight. Each loss was small, insignificant on its own, but together they formed a pattern that Lucas could no longer ignore. Someone was stealing from him, toying with him, and they were doing it with terrifying precision. He began to take precautions, tying his tent shut from the inside, sleeping with his rifle in hand. But the thefts continued, each one bolder than the last. A pair of socks, a water filter, a map. They vanished as if plucked by invisible hands. Lucas's paranoia grew, his mind conjuring images of a faceless figure lurking just beyond the firelight, watching, waiting. He checked his satellite phone, but the signal was dead, the mountains blocking any connection to the outside world. He was alone, 100 miles from civilization, with no way to call for help. By the seventh day, Lucas was unraveling. The solitude, once his refuge, had become a prison. Every rustle in the bushes was a footstep, every flicker of shadow a silhouette. He began to hallucinate, his exhausted mind playing cruel tricks. Once he swore he stepped into a puddle, the cold water soaking his boot, only to find the ground bone-dry. Another time he heard laughter, low, guttural, echoing through the trees. But when he spun around, there was nothing but silence. The hallucinations were vivid, disorienting, and they fed his growing terror. He wondered if he was losing his mind, if the wilderness itself was turning against him. On the eighth night, Lucas woke to the sound of footsteps circling his campsite. They were slow, deliberate, crunching through the pine needles with a rhythm that spoke of intent. He gripped his rifle, his body paralyzed with fear, unable to move as the steps grew closer. The tent's zipper twitched, as if someone were testing it, and Lucas's heart nearly stopped. He wanted to shout, to confront the intruder, but his voice caught in his throat. After an eternity, the footsteps faded, retreating into the woods. Lucas didn't sleep again, his eyes burning as he stared into the darkness, waiting for dawn. The next morning, he broke camp in a frenzy, his hands shaking so badly he could barely pack his gear. He was close now, 2 days from his jeep, maybe less if he pushed himself. But the thought of another night in the woods was unbearable. He made a desperate decision. He would hike through the night, no stopping, no camping, until he reached safety. It was reckless, dangerous even, but the alternative, facing whatever was stalking him, was worse. As the sun set, Lucas pressed on, his flashlight casting a feeble glow against the encroaching darkness. The trail was treacherous at night, roots and rocks threatening to trip him with every step. His body ached, his mind fogged with exhaustion, but fear kept him moving. An hour into the night, he heard it again. Footsteps, faint but unmistakable, trailing him through the trees. He spun around, his flashlight sweeping the forest, and caught a glimpse of something. A shape, human but wrong, slipping behind a tree. His blood turned to ice. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Come out, or I swear I'll shoot." He aimed his rifle at the tree, his finger trembling on the trigger. For a moment, there was only silence. Then slowly a figure stepped into the light. It was a man, or something like a man, But Lucas had never seen anything so grotesque. He was tall, emaciated, his skin a patchwork of scars and filth, stretched taut over bones that seemed to protrude at unnatural angles. His hair was a matted tangle, his face obscured by a wild beard. But his eyes, those eyes burned with a feral intensity that made Lucas's stomach lurch. He was nearly naked, wearing only a pair of Lucas's shorts, stolen from his pack days ago. Blood and dirt crusted his bare feet, and in his hand, he clutched Lucas's missing Swiss Army knife, its blade glinting in the flashlight's beam. The man took a step forward, and Lucas fired a warning shot into the ground beside him. The crack of the rifle echoed through the forest, and the man flinched, his lips curling into a snarl. For a moment, Lucas thought he would charge, but instead, the man turned and sprinted into the woods, his movements unnaturally swift, like a predator retreating to regroup. Lucas didn't wait to see if he'd return. He ran, his flashlight bobbing wildly, his lungs burning as he pushed his body to its limits. Hours later, he stumbled into the parking lot where his Jeep waited, his legs buckling beneath him. He locked the doors, his hands shaking as he fumbled for his keys, and called the police on his satellite phone, now miraculously picking up a signal. When they arrived, they listened to his story with skeptical frowns, jotting notes but offering little comfort. "Get out of here," one officer said, glancing nervously at the woods. "Don't come back." Lucas drove home that night, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those burning eyes in the darkness. He hasn't hiked since, and the thought of returning to the wilderness fills him with dread. The PCT, once his haven, is now a place of nightmares, haunted by the memory of a man, or something worse, that stalked him through the trees. He keeps his rifle by his bed now, and at night, when the wind howls outside, he swears he hears footsteps circling, waiting, just beyond the walls. Story 3, The Logger's Nightmare. In the wilds of the Pacific Northwest, where ancient forests cloak mountains untouched by man, Daniel Reed, a grizzled logger nearing 50, faced a terror that would haunt him forever. It was 2017, and Daniel, a veteran of decades in the deep woods, worked a remote job site on a desolate peak, reachable only by a road carved over 3 weeks. This job, grueling and isolated, would break him. Daniel was part of a small logging crew operating a tree saw, a beastly machine that felled century-old pines with ease. Paid by the tree, he pushed himself through 16-hour days, fueled by coffee and grit. His only companion was Griffin Tate, a sharp-eyed logger with a cautious streak Daniel lacked. Together, they carved through an ancient forest on a misty plateau, ringed by cliffs and silent but for their machine's roar. The rest of the crew would arrive later to haul the timber, leaving the mountain to Daniel and Griffin for now. For 10 days, they worked in sync, their radios buzzing with banter. But on the 11th day, something changed. Static hissed through their radios, faint at first, then growing into murmurs. Low guttural voices whispering fragments. Water, fire, coming. Daniel, assuming mountain interference, tweaked the channels, but the voices persisted, clearer each day. Griffin, practical but uneasy, suggested another crew or poachers, but Daniel doubted it. They were too far from civilization for stray signals. Other signs emerged. Barefoot prints, unnaturally large and deep, appeared in the mud. Rusted tin cans, freshly open, littered the underbrush. Near a stream, they found a campsite, a stone ring, a tattered blanket, and bones that looked human. Each discovery tightened the knot in Daniel's gut, but he pressed on, driven by the paycheck. On the 15th day, Griffin spotted a tent hidden in a thicket. Against Daniel's instincts, they investigated. Inside was a mildewed sleeping bag and a duffel bag that chilled them. Children's clothing, torn, stained underwear, along with duct tape, rope, and crude sketches of children in horrific scenes. A fresh Polaroid of an apple on a rock suggested someone had been there recently. Griffin urged them to leave and call the police, but Daniel, stubborn and broke, refused. They agreed to limit radio use and work through the night, rifles nearby. The mountain felt alive now, its shadows menacing. That night, their camper's radio crackled unbidden. The voices were distinct, 2 men discussing firewood and water, their casual tone chilling. Daniel realized these were the tent's owners, the ones behind the drawings. Griffin urged calm, but Daniel's fear grew, his mind conjuring figures circling in the dark. The next night, anger overtook him. When the voices returned, he grabbed the radio and shouted, demanding answers. Silence followed, heavy and absolute. Griffin, furious, accused him of provoking trouble. Before they could argue, footsteps crunched outside, slow, deliberate. Daniel's heart raced. His rifle, he realized with dread, was unloaded, the ammunition in the truck 20 yards away. Griffin, unarmed, froze as the door handle jiggled, followed by scratching, long claw-like drags across the metal. For 4 minutes, they sat paralyzed, the sound relentless. Daniel's fear turned to desperation. Ignoring Griffin's protests, he grabbed a flashlight and flung the door open. Pain exploded as a knife slashed his face, blood blinding him. He fell, a filthy man looming over him, knife at his throat. Another figure kicked his head, stars bursting in his vision. Griffin tackled the knife wielder, and both attackers fled into the forest. Griffin dragged Daniel to the truck, blood soaking the seats as they raced to a hospital. Doctors saved Daniel's left eye, but not his right, the cut leaving a misshapen pupil. Police found nothing. No tent, no footprints, erased by rain. The voices never returned. 2 weeks later, as the crew finished the job, they found Tommy, a young logger, bound and brutalized in a ditch, dead. No one was ever caught. Daniel retired, broken, to a small apartment far from the woods. His ruined eye sees shadows, and at night he hears faint scratching, as if the men from the forest are still waiting.